In the year 5055, humanity conquered time. What followed was chaos. Nations collapsed. The rich rewrote history. The world nearly tore itself apart. So Earth formed one last line of defense. Tac-Time. Tactical chrono-intervention and monitoring enforcement. Elite 5-person teams deployed across history to protect the timeline. Team Bravo 1969 was the best until the day they vanished. Gone for 3 minutes in real time, but for them, 21 years. This is their story. The ghosts who saved the future by living through the past. Tac-Time, Bravo 1969. Written by Brian M. Brumbaugh. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. Prologue. The Turning Point. Year 5555. Location: Global Enforcement Authority Headquarters, Earth. It began with a blink, not a bang, not a flash of light, not a ripple in the sky, just a quiet confirmation buried in the logs of a cold, sterile lab in Geneva. Temporal displacement successful. T 0.02 seconds. The year was 5515, and time travel had officially entered the realm of the possible. The physicist who triggered it was heralded as the next Einstein. His face was plastered on hollow billboards across the solar system. The word chronoscience became the hottest field on Earth. Governments salivated. Corporations circled like sharks. Historians panicked. Within 5 years, the world had fractured, not politically but temporally. Mega conglomerates exploited micro-loops to inflate market trades. Billionaires rewound their failures and doubled down on successes. Entire legal systems collapsed under the weight of retroactive loopholes. The privileged lived in curated bubbles of altered pasts. The poor? They stayed poor. They stayed now. Then came the Time Bandits, a loose network of rebels, warlords, anarchists, and fallen elites who no longer believed in the concept of present. They trafficked in altered births, assassinated ancestors, and flooded history with chaos for hire. The future bent under the strain. By 5528, reality was fraying. Wars happened that had never occurred. Cities vanished from one day to the next. People woke up to find themselves married to strangers, or not born at all. And then, finally, the world said, enough. In 5530, the leaders of every nation met in a bunker 800 feet beneath Antarctica. There were no flags, no titles, no vetoes. Only survival. They signed the Pact of Unified Continuity, dissolving all sovereign borders. From that moment on, the world was simply Earth. A new constitution was ratified, eerily reminiscent of a long-dead republic from centuries past. It reinstated individual liberty, economic freedom, and one radical clause: every citizen of Earth would be armed. With the burden of defense shared, street-level crime plummeted. Armed societies, it turned out, were polite ones, at least in this new world. Order returned. A one-world economy flourished. The middle class rose again. But time was still broken. In 5535, Earth established the Global Enforcement Authority, the most powerful institution in history. Within it, a specialized force was commissioned. Tac-Time. Tactical chrono-intervention and monitoring enforcement. Their mandate was simple: fix the timeline, stop the bandits, preserve history, by any means necessary. For the next 20 years, they waged a silent war across centuries, restoring fractured moments, deleting dangerous echoes, and eliminating threats before they were born. They were ghosts in the machine of time. And in 5555, Tac-Time launched its most critical mission yet. Team BRAVO1969 was selected to travel back to the year 1803. Intelligence had uncovered a French Time Bandit cell plotting to sabotage the Louisiana Purchase, a single disruption that could fracture the growth of the United States and send geopolitical shockwaves through the 21st century. It was supposed to be a routine containment op: in and out, neutralize, return, debrief. But something went wrong. Something that would stretch the limits of sanity, loyalty, and identity. Something that would turn 5 elite agents into strangers to their own time. Something that would cost them 21 years, and almost their humanity. The chrono log recorded their departure. 3 minutes passed. Then the alarms began to scream. Chapter 1. Bravo Rising. Year 5555. Location, Tac-Time Command Facility, Dome 9, North American Sector. The storm over the Mojave was synthetic. Artificial lightning danced across the glass ceiling of Dome 9, a high-atmosphere simulation hub tucked beneath layers of desert rock and reinforced chrono-shielding. The weather wasn't real, but the war being waged inside it was. Joe Burrow ducked behind a shattered holographic column as simulated musket fire cracked overhead. The digital rebels weren't pulling punches. One clipped the stone just above his head, sending programmable dust spraying across his faceplate. "Stacy," he barked into the comms. "Tell me you've cracked the encryption on that damn field generator." Stacy Kim's voice buzzed through the link, cool and sharp. 10 more seconds. Or 15 if you keep yelling. Joe gritted his teeth. Behind him, Brian Bohr sprinted through the chaos, dragging a simulated civilian over his shoulder. A musket ball clipped Brian in the shoulder, real enough to hurt, not real enough to bleed. "Karma, status," Joe called. Across the training arena, Stephanie Karma crouched beneath a collapsed market stall, fingers flying across a tactile data pad. Her voice was calm, focused, too calm for a simulated war zone. "Local history says this riot never escalated. Someone's rewriting the sequence. Probably our bandits." "Tommy, you see our bandits yet?" Joe asked. Silence. Then, no visual. "But I smell French tobacco, and I smell trouble." Tommy Galleone's dry wit crackled over the comms just as he leapt from the second story of a colonial inn, landing beside Joe with 2 fists and a grin. He tossed Joe a mock-up time tag detonator. Happy training day. The fake battlefield froze. The storm above flickered out. The sky returned to its default blue, the kind that was too perfect to be real. A klaxon sounded, and a smooth female voice filled the chamber. "Simulation complete. Team Bravo 1969 97% efficiency. Margin of error 3.2%. Recommend deployment ready." The walls dissolved into white light. Reality returned. Joe pulled off his helmet and ran a hand through his sweat-slicked hair. Around him, his team did the same. Stacy's neural implant blinked behind her left ear, glowing faint blue. Stephanie slid a stylus into her braid. Brian rolled his shoulder and winced. Tommy cracked his knuckles with a smirk. No one spoke, not until Joe said it out loud. Final eval passed. A long silence. Then Brian, "We're going back in time, later that day. Briefing room Theta -9. The 5 of them sat in the black chairs like gladiators awaiting the arena gate. The lights were dim. A projection of North America circa 1803 hovered above the table, marked in red at the Mississippi River. Louisiana Territory. French claimed. Not for much longer. Director Harlan Warden entered without fanfare. His left leg was mechanical, his right eye synthetic. His coat bore the triple insignia of the GEA, Tac-Time, and first-gen Chrono Command. He was a living reminder of the days when time travel was still experimental and still cost lives. "You're being sent to May 1st, 1803, Warden said. "Intel confirms a bandit cell has already arrived. Objective, prevent the Louisiana Purchase. If successful, they fracture the U.S. continental growth. Europe holds the western half of North America. By 2050, nuclear war," Stacy whistled. "All that from one treaty?" "It's not just a treaty," Stephanie said. "It's the hinge. You destroy the hinge, the door never opens." Warden nodded. "Team Bravo 1969, you're our first field team since the signal stabilization upgrade. Your chrono anchor will link to beacon node 7. If the tether holds, you'll have 6 hours on the ground. If it doesn't—" He let that hang. Joe leaned forward. "What's the fallback?" "You don't want to know." No one spoke. Warden tapped the screen. 5 names appeared. BRAVO1969 deployment team, and Joe Burrow, team leader. Stacy Kim, tech specialist. Stephanie Karma, historical expert. Brian Baugh, enforcement. Tommy Gaglione, enforcement. Warden closed the file. "Get your kits. You jump in 12 hours. Don't alter anything not necessary. Don't trust anyone outside your window. And if you see yourselves—" He looked straight at Joe. "Kill the copy, scene shift, Tac-Time locker bay." The chrono suits hissed as they sealed. Each was custom fit, layered with impact mesh, nanofiber armor, and temporal shielding. Their helmets bore HUDs calibrated to the year, language, and cultural markers of the destination. Stephanie slipped a Jeffersonian map into her thigh pouch. Brian loaded a flintlock replica with a hidden plasma charge. Tommy holstered an antique-looking pistol that could stop a tank. Stacy's neural interface synced with her wristpad and the embedded AI in her spine. Joe stood at the center, helmet in hand. 3 minutes in real time, he said. No mistakes, no loose ends, no interference. They nodded as one. Behind them, the chrono relay sparked to life, a spiraling ring of energy spinning faster than the eye could track. Blue lightning arced across the platform. Warden's voice echoed from the chamber above. "Team Bravo 1969, you are green for insertion. Destination 1803. Objective, restore the purchase, stop the bandits, protect the hinge." Joe looked at his team. "Let's rewrite history the right way." The light swallowed them whole. Chapter 2. The Temporal Gauntlet. Year 5555. Location: Tac-Time Launch Complex 3, Global Enforcement Authority Central Hub. The final countdown was silent. Not because of tradition, but because sound didn't carry properly inside the temporal dampening field. The chrono relay vibrated in a visible blur, suspended over a magnetic platform that hummed beneath the boots of Team Bravo 1969. From the command room above, Director Warden watched like a priest before the altar. Technicians moved with choreographed precision, monitoring everything. Temporal anchor points, gravitational harmonics, chroma sync integrity, and one fragile number pulsing in red across the upper corner of the tactical display. Beacon lock, 92% stability. Anything below 90 and they'd abort, anything above 95 and they'd risk burning through to the wrong year. Joe Burrow stood center on the launch pad, shoulders squared, hands steady at his sides. His chronovest vibrated slightly as the field synced to his biosignature. Behind him, Stacy Kim floated mid-air, suspended in her exochair. Dozens of virtual displays wrapped around her like petals, each one managing real-time feedback from the tether beacon's satellite grid orbiting Earth. "This is going to be tight," she muttered, fingers dancing. "The 1803 convergence point is weaker than projected." "How weak?" Joe asked. Stacy's eye twitched. "Like, don't fart too hard. Weak." Stephanie Karma clipped a leather-bound notebook into her vest. 1803 is a delicate year. So many dominoes stacked on a single signature, Jefferson's, if the bandits push hard enough. "They won't," Brian said. He locked his weapon into his shoulder holster. "Because we'll push harder." Tommy Gaglione adjusted his pulse blade, then smirked. "Dibs on bayoneting the first time traitor we meet." Joe turned to his team. He'd trained with them for years, trusted them with his life. But time travel wasn't war, it was worse. You didn't just bleed in the timeline, you rippled. "Remember the rules," Joe said, voice low and firm. "No name drops, no technology leaks, no unneeded interference. If it didn't happen in the history books, we don't cause it." Stacy chimed in. And if the tether fails, we wait, Stephanie finished grimly, for the next convergence. 7 years minimum, Brian's face fell. 7 years stuck in the 1800s? No caffeine, no showers, no music? Tommy grinned. I'm built for that. Warden's voice crackled through the intercom. BRAVO1969. Final beacon sync 94.2%. You're clear for jump. The chrono relay flared with blue light. Time folded like paper. T-04. The team moved onto the platform in formation. Joe at the front, Stacy behind him, Stephanie center left, Brian and Tommy flanking the rear. The relay shrieked as the magnetic field synchronized with the beacon grid above. Reality grew thin. Stephanie's eyes widened. I smell smoke. Brian blinked. What? Gunpowder, she whispered. It's already leaking through. The light turned white hot. Temporal jump initiated. The world inverted. Date, May 1st, 1803. Location, New Orleans territory. They hit the ground hard. Air rushed in. Heat, humidity, noise. Joe rolled instinctively, scanning the dirt-packed alley. The sound of horses, shouting, French voices. A nearby bell tower rang noon. All 5 agents emerged, groggy, coughing, disoriented, but intact. Then Stacy's voice sliced through the comms like a blade. We've got a problem. Joe turned. Her HUD flickered. Her gear glitched. The beacon signal's gone. Tether's dead. The air felt heavier. Everything wrong. Brian spoke what everyone else was thinking. We're stuck elsewhere in the city. A shadow watches. A man in a crimson waistcoat stepped back from the rooftop edge. He adjusted the bandana on his wrist, a woven cloth sewn from the future. 5 agents, he whispered in French. He turned to the others, armed, waiting. Kill them all before they adjust the past. Chapter 3, The First Loop. Date, May 1, 1803. Location, New Orleans territory, French-controlled Louisiana. The alley smelled like piss, sweat, and gunpowder. Joe Burrow pushed himself up from the mud, his body still shaking from the insertion shock. The world was too vivid, colors oversaturated, air thick with pollen and powder smoke. It was like stepping into a painting that could kill you. Roll call, he snapped. I'm here, Stephanie Karma coughed, brushing straw off her chrono suit. She looked up and winced at the gaslight street signs. Definitely 1803, language markers and architecture line up. Brian, Tommy? Joe asked. Alive, Brian grunted, already pulling a tarp over a stack of crates to conceal his gear. Bleeding, Tommy added with a grin, lifting his sleeve to reveal a small cut. From a cabbage cart. I think history already hates me. Joe turned to Stacy. What's the signal status? Stacy Kim stood pale, staring at her wrist module as it cycled red across every frequency. Her voice was hollow. The tether's gone. Beacon signal failed. No link, no extraction. Joe exhaled through his nose. That was the worst-case scenario. And yet somehow it didn't feel like a surprise. Later that day, French Quarter safe house. They relocated to a 2-room apartment Stephanie had memorized from an obscure letter written in the 1890s. Safe enough. Hidden behind a bakery, its owners long dead before writing any history. The mission was still clear. Ensure the Louisiana Purchase proceeds. Neutralize any bandit interference. Do not alter history unless required. But the window had narrowed. We're not getting out until the next beacon convergence, Stacy said, spreading a hand-drawn map of beacon alignments across the table. If the temporal cycle holds, that's roughly 7 years from now. Earth's rotation, solar flare patterns, harmonic drift, everything has to line up. Joe ran a hand through his hair. So we stay alive, stay invisible, and finish the mission. Tommy snorted. Sure. In powdered wigs and breeches, Brian leaned against the wall, cleaning his modified flintlock. We can blend. We've trained for this. We speak the language. Hell, I look like half the pirates down here. Stephanie circled key events on the map. and Jefferson's envoys arriving, and Napoleon's orders. The bandits' known appearances in port records. "There's one problem," she said, tapping a dot marked May 10th. "There's no historical record of the French envoys ever arriving in New Orleans." Joe froze. Someone already changed something. Week 2, undercover. The team scattered like shadow into the threads of 1803, each assuming a role, each with their own battlefield. Stacy Kim had set up shop in the back of a cobbler's cellar, bribing the old man upstairs with a promise of light without fire. Her crude lab reeked of scorched copper wire, whale oil smoke, and ink-stained blueprints. She worked by candlelight, fingers blackened and bleeding, from trying to force 21st-century logic onto 19th-century junk. Every day, she cannibalized more: lantern coils, early voltaic batteries, mechanical clocks, and even the guts of a stolen telegraph prototype she lifted from a French army courier. Her goal was simple: re-establish a signal, any signal, to home base. But nothing held long enough. Too much interference, too much time. She muttered theories to herself that would sound like witchcraft to anyone listening: resonance drift, temporal magnetism, quantum regression. Her only reprieve came from the hummingbird tattoo on her wrist, her own crude anchor against temporal memory loss. She didn't have time to forget who she was. Stephanie Karma became Mademoiselle Geneviève Rousseau, the charming niece of a dead merchant no one missed enough to question. With her soft drawl and fluent French, she glided into the social elite like she'd always belonged. Salons, opera houses, garden picnics with governors' wives. Her smile opened doors, her subtle flirtations unlocked secrets. She wore silk gloves to hide the scar on her palm, the one from her final Tac-Time trial, slicing open her own hand to reset a corrupted time loop. Now, she sipped tea, while members of Napoleon's intelligence circle whispered state secrets inches from her ear. In those hushed parlors, she nudged history back toward the Louisiana Purchase with grace and guile, steering trade deals, correcting rumors, planting suggestions like seeds. And at night, she scribbled coded reports beneath her corset lace, tucking them into books for Joe to retrieve. No one ever suspected the bright-eyed songstress in satin might be the woman most likely to destroy them. Brian Bohr and Tommy Gallioni worked the underside of the timeline, the docks, the back rooms, the gutters of New Orleans. Officially, they were hired muscle. Unofficially, they were fire and steel. Brian's broad shoulders and Louisiana drawl made him a natural fit among the stevedores. He carried crates and cracked skulls with equal ease, earning quick trust and quicker fear. Tommy was quieter, quicker, deadlier. He posed as a brawler for hire, earning coin in bare-knuckle fights that doubled as recruitment screens for local resistance. They played both sides, bribing customs officers with silver and drowning bandit sympathizers in the bay with stones tied to their ankles. No one could prove anything. The fights were always blamed on gang disputes. The bodies never found. Every night the two of them returned to the safe house reeking of sweat, rum, and blood. Neither talked much. They didn't have to. Joe Burrow, meanwhile, became a dozen men. To the French he was Jean Bardouin, a wounded veteran of the Revolution. To the Americans, John Barrett, a Mississippi trader with a limp and a penchant for bourbon. To the bandits he was no one, and everyone. He moved through brothels and barracks, barristers' offices and butcher stalls. He eavesdropped in confessionals, slipped coded threats into prayer books, and left broken fingers behind as warnings. Some days he wore a stolen uniform, others he passed as a beggar. He sold counterfeit land deeds to rich landowners just to cause confusion. He burned documents. He forged new ones. He rewrote small pieces of history, again and again, until they matched the outcome they were fighting for. At night, Joe returned to the safe house without a word. He hung up whatever face he wore that day and collapsed on the cot closest to the door, never sleeping more than a few hours. Sometimes his hands shook. Sometimes he stared at the wall like it held secrets the rest of them couldn't see. He was becoming a ghost in his own mission. By the end of week 2, they had rooted themselves into the fabric of 1,803 New Orleans. But the clock was ticking, and the bandits were watching. Year 3. The compromise. By the 3rd year in the loop, the bandits had grown smarter, more subtle, more ruthless. They no longer tried brute force changes to the timeline, no more arson at printing presses or bomb plots in shipping depots. Now it was needles instead of hammers, tiny edits to history, silent replacements of key figures, forged signatures, misdirected letters, quiet sabotage, butterfly warfare. BRAVO1969 adapted the only way they could. They broke their own rules. It was Joe who made the call. A French agent, real name Etienne Moreau, code name Lierre, had intercepted a letter penned by Robert Livingston, the U.S. Minister to France, meant to confirm Napoleon's final agreement to sell the Louisiana territory. The original document had been rerouted to a French outpost in Saint-Domingue, where it would be replaced with a false version that nullified the sale entirely. The bandits were betting on chaos. Protocol demanded surveillance, tracking, patience. Joe chose none of the above. He met Moreau in a winehouse courtyard under a gas lamp's flicker, both men cloaked and armed. The conversation was short. The gunshot was silent, courtesy of Stacy's handmade suppressor, a Frankenstein device stitched from brass tubing, cloth, and whispers of future tech. Moreau's body was never found. Joe burned the corpse in a lime pit behind the safe house and never spoke of it again. Stephanie, meanwhile, worked through the night by candlelight, hunched over parchment, painstakingly duplicating Livingston's handwriting. The ink had to match. The paper had to smell right. The phrasing had to carry just the right diplomatic tone. A single error and history would notice. She wore gloves while she wrote to hide the way her fingers trembled. By dawn, she rode side saddle as Genevieve Rousseau, the letter hidden in the false bottom of a violin case. She handed it off to a trusted courier, an abolitionist preacher who owed her his life, and watched him disappear north, toward Washington, D.C. That single forged letter arrived 7 days earlier than the now-dead original. It was received, read, and filed by Thomas Jefferson himself. The gears of history clicked forward again. Small ripple, massive effect. They had just bent time with paper and blood. When the Louisiana Purchase was publicly announced that summer, 828,000 square miles of land bought for $15 million. The team stood scattered in the square, blending into the crowd like ghosts in borrowed skin. Stacy leaned against a lamppost, watching the gathering through smoked lenses. Tommy smoked a pipe near a crate of oranges, one hand on a hidden revolver. Brian stood beside a brass band, a head taller than anyone else, arms crossed. Stephanie wore widow's black, her expression unreadable, and Joe, silent as always, watched from a rooftop above them all, hat low, coat pulled tight, eyes never blinking. There were cheers around them, celebration, speeches, the rise of American manifest destiny. But within Bravo 1969, there was no joy, no high fives, no back pats. They didn't feel like heroes. They felt like survivors. History hadn't broken, but neither had they. Not yet. Years 3 to 5, fracture. Time didn't pass anymore. It accumulated. The mission had once been clear. Prevent interference. Preserve history. Go home. By year 3, the bandits had gone to ground, and Bravo 1969 was no longer chasing enemies. They were chasing shadows, and slowly turning into them. The cracks started small, then came the splinters, then the fracture. Brian and Tommy, the team's hammer and blade, were the first to break. They'd once been inseparable, brothers in war, drinking partners, wingmen in half a dozen barroom brawls that ended with more blood than glory. But something had changed. Tommy believed in surgical strikes. Identify the enemy, remove the threat, move on. Brian had lost patience for precision. History doesn't bleed pretty, he said after gutting a known bandit sympathizer in front of the man's wife. It bleeds red like the rest of us. Their argument in the back of the safe house turned into a fist fight that nearly collapsed the foundation wall. Brian's knuckles were split for a week. Tommy's jaw clicked when he chewed. They never truly spoke after that. Only exchanged grunts and sideways glances. One slept near the back door, the other near the front. Trust had died, and with it, the unit's cohesion. Stacy Kim drifted somewhere far past reason. She began pinning constellations to the ceiling of the safe house with chalk and nails, tracing celestial patterns that shouldn't have existed in this century. She muttered about stellar lock loss and anchoring temporal drift through axial markers. Her scribbled math-filled pages, then walls, then furniture. The team called it star sickness. She called it clarity. Her eyes changed too. Less fire, more frost. She stopped responding to nicknames, only answering to Agent Kim. She rarely left the safe house except to climb to the roof, night after night, staring at skies not meant for her century, searching for a pattern that might pull them home. One morning, she burned her old Tac-Time badge. It's a dead signal, she said, not explaining if she meant the tech or the organization. Stephanie Karma withdrew in a quieter way. She kept attending salons, social events, even a few opera nights, but her presence became more ghost-like. She stopped gathering intel. She stopped trying to correct history. Instead, she began to document it, not in mission logs, in letters. She wrote dozens each week, folded into old journals, tucked between floorboards, buried in glass jars. Letters to a future that might never exist, to a version of herself that might never be born, sometimes addressed to her younger self, sometimes to her brother, Andy, sometimes to Joe. Most she never signed. She never let anyone read them, but everyone could feel the ache behind every pen stroke. She still smiled in public. She still wore the silks and pearls, but at night, when she removed the disguise, she looked like someone already mourning the world. And Joe? Joe stopped using time at all. Calendars disappeared from the safe house. Watches were dismantled. Clocks were turned to the wall or smashed outright. He no longer cared if it was Tuesday or 1804 or year 5 or the third loop of this timeline. Instead, he took up reading, not strategy or protocol or briefings. Journals, old ones, first-hand accounts written by soldiers, traders, widows, and dying poets. He read them all, hunting for clues, for signs. He didn't say it aloud, but everyone knew what he was looking for. Mentions of ghosts, ghosts in long black coats, men and women who appeared and vanished, whispers of strangers who knew too much. He read them, hoping, dreading, he'd find them, that they'd already bled into the record, and when he wasn't reading, he was rolling cigars by hand. They tasted like dirt and regret. He never offered to share. By year 5, BRAVO1969 no longer felt like a team. They were 5 agents in the same timeline, each orbiting their own personal collapse. The mission had become a memory. Home was a myth. And time? Time was no longer a river. It was a noose. Year 7, the convergence. The signs were subtle at first, brighter nights, stranger tides, birds flying north in winter, and then the sky changed. It shimmered with unfamiliar colors, auroras rippling across latitudes they had no business touching. Stargazers in 1809 called it an omen. Stacy Kim called it confirmation. Her calculations, years in the making and scrawled across every inch of safe house stone and sailcloth, had finally converged. A rare solar flare, synchronized with an irregular geomagnetic pulse and a precise Earth-Moon axial alignment. the kind that might happen once every few millennia, was creating something Stacy had only theorized until now. A naturally occurring wormhole, not a portal built by Tac-Time, not stable, not safe, but real. It was opening, for minutes, maybe seconds, enough. She moved like a woman possessed. She ripped open crates of stolen parts, soldered wire with heated blades, cannibalized a busted Navy lantern and a broken sextant for components. Using early galvanic batteries from French science outposts and 2 high-powered cells pilfered from a Prussian arms shipment, she built a receiver, crude, ugly, but tuned to frequencies that didn't yet exist. Then she unlocked a lead case they had buried 6 years earlier, the recall node, cold to the touch, still blinking. Stacy wired it in, her hands shaking for the first time in months. At exactly 2:17 a.m., under a fractured sky, she flipped the switch. The node hummed, then howled, a rising frequency that made the stones in the basement tremble. She whispered, "We're going home." That's when the wall exploded. The bandits had been watching, waiting. They had one rule: if BRAVO1969 gets out, the timeline locks forever. So they struck, one final time. The blast blew out the southern wall of the safe house. Dust, brick, screams, gunpowder, smoke, knives in the dark. They came in waves, dressed in stolen uniforms and shadows. Flintlocks, sabers, even blades laced with slow-acting poisons. Their timing was perfect. Their objective, destroy the beacon and make sure no one left. Joe Burrow was first to fall. He caught the edge of a bayonet under the ribs, deep, twisting. He didn't scream. He just went down hard, coughing blood, one hand on the wound, the other still clutching his pistol. He shot one attacker through the temple before collapsing. Tommy dragged him across the shattered floor, firing blind with his offhand, teeth clenched so tight blood leaked from his gums. He kicked open the hidden passage beneath the stairs and laid Joe beside the beacon. Brian turned into a storm. He met the charge head-on, shirtless, coated in soot, wielding a rusted cavalry saber in one hand and a broken chair leg in the other. He killed 4 men before the 5th took his knee out with a hatchet. He didn't go down. He crawled and finished the job with his teeth. Stephanie was bleeding from the scalp, a ball gown shredded, mascara smeared with sweat and soot. But she held the receiver steady with one hand, and in the other she scribbled final coordinates on the transmission sheet using a blood-stained quill. She kissed the corner of the page for luck and shoved it into the beacon slot. "Coordinates sent," she said, her voice cracked. "Burn the bastard in." The world buckled. The beacon roared to life. Light pulsed through the stone like a heartbeat. A sound like thunder underwater swallowed the room, and the air shimmered as gravity fractured. Joe opened his eyes just long enough to whisper, "This better not be heaven." Light swallowed them. The safe house, the bodies, the blood, the mission. Everything folded inward as time rewrote itself. One final merciless turn of the screw. Chapter 4. The Second Loop. Date, October 28th, 1929. Location, New York City, Wall Street. They landed in a pile of ash and shattered illusions. Smoke curled from toppled chimneys. The air reeked of ozone, coal, and desperation. Above them, the steel skyline of Lower Manhattan clawed at the grey heavens, buildings trembling in a city that had just lost everything. Papers drifted from broken windows like burnt snowflakes. Torn ticker tape fluttered down from above, its confetti-like dance mocking the silence below. Across the street, a crowd gathered, mostly men in tailored suits and wide-brimmed hats, yelling numbers that no longer mattered. A man screamed into his palms and tore at his collar like he was trying to strangle himself with it. Joe Burrow sat up against a broken newspaper box, breath ragged. His ribs ached, no blood, no wound, but the ghost of the bayonet from 7 years and 5 seconds ago still throbbed like it remembered. He grunted and looked around, slowly realizing what day it was, not from a calendar, but from the weight of it. A banker sobbed across the street, muttering prayers to a god made of gold. And then, without hesitation, he stepped off the roof of the Equitable building. No one tried to stop him. No one screamed. They were used to the sound of things breaking. Stephanie Karma groaned as she sat up inside a shattered fruit cart, her skirt stained with bruised apples and glass dust. Her hat rolled lazily into the gutter, stopping beside a discarded heel and a child's doll face down in the muck. A gust of wind slapped a torn newspaper across her knees. She blinked at the headline, "Stock market crashes, Black Monday." Her voice was hoarse when she whispered, "Jesus, we're in the Depression." Tommy Gallioni hauled himself out of a garbage bin, smelling like banana peels, whiskey and regret. He looked up at the crumbling skyline and snorted. "Feels like home. Later. Abandoned tenement, Lower Manhattan." They found shelter in a condemned brick building 3 blocks from the East River. It leaned like it wanted to collapse but couldn't afford to. The wallpaper peeled like skin, and rats didn't run. They walked, as if even they were too tired to scurry. Within 48 hours, they had everything they needed. Tommy and Brian looted laundromats and mugged bootleggers for clothes. Stephanie forged names pulled from census lists and long-forgotten war records. Stacy rewired a pre-war radio, twisting copper from stolen telephone lines, her fingers twitching like they still remembered what frequency home felt like. But it was Joe who moved like a ghost. He didn't issue orders. He didn't lead. He just stood by windows, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes and watching the world fall apart. Again. This wasn't the same war. This one moved slower, quieter, meaner, and it had no end date. Week 1, Discovery. The first 7 days in 1929 were quiet, too quiet. No echo of bandit activity, no future signals, no anomalies they could feel in their bones, which is why Stephanie Karma noticed it right away. She was walking past the New York Stock Exchange just before dawn, dressed as a stenographer in a blue peacoat and cloche hat. Her heels clicked against the damp sidewalk as she passed under a flickering lamppost, the kind that hummed with the tired breath of a city on the edge of collapse. At first glance, the scratch marks at the post's base looked like a child had taken a pocket knife to it. Crude, jagged, random. But to Stephanie, they weren't scratches. They were glyphs. Bandit code. She knelt casually to tie her shoe and whispered the symbols under her breath, translating them automatically. Cycle 2.2 initiated. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't a blind drop-in. The bandits weren't playing catch-up. They'd been here, possibly for months, maybe longer. They weren't trying to rewrite 1929 from scratch. They were picking up where they left off. That night, Stacy Kim was deep in the bones of the abandoned tenement, surrounded by piles of copper wire, salvaged radio guts and stolen telephone components. She worked by candlelight, fingers twitching, mouth chewing the edge of a pencil like she could taste the signal in the wood. She was tapping into the city's electromagnetic noise, listening not just to frequencies, but anomalies. And she found one. At first it came through as nothing, static shaped like chaos. But when she looped it through her makeshift frequency modulator, the signal shifted, a faint pulse, almost like Morse code, buried too deep for the decade. When she isolated the waveform and slowed it down, her heart stopped. 29th century encryption, compression keys with quantum twist signatures, Tac-Time neural protocol references that shouldn't even exist for another 900 years. "They're signaling someone," she muttered. Or something. The bandits weren't hiding. They were coordinating. 2 nights later, Brian Bohr caught a man following Stephanie. It was a rainy evening on Delancey Street. Stephanie was returning from her editor's office, umbrella in one hand, portfolio under the other, when she saw the reflection in a shop window. A tall man in a grey overcoat, walking too slowly, too deliberately. The kind of man who watched, not wandered. She didn't panic. She kept walking, but she tapped the inside of her portfolio once, a silent signal. Brian was already watching from a rooftop above. By the time the man turned into the alley behind Rosenbaum's bakery, Brian was already waiting for him in the dark. "You lost?" Brian asked, stepping from the shadows, voice low and solid. The man didn't flinch. He smiled, no accent, no ID, just a smirk, like he already knew how this ended. Brian didn't ask a second time. He swung the tire iron into the man's kneecap, and the sound that followed wasn't entirely human. The fight was quick, brutal. The man bled red but moved like something wired. When it was over, Brian was soaked in rain and blood, standing over a corpse that looked like it was still waiting to reboot. He dragged the body into the bakery's backroom freezer and called for Stacy. Under the man's skin, beneath a false patch of dermal tissue on the wrist, Stacy found it. Not a tattoo, not ink, nanocarbon circuitry, a living map fused to the man's nervous system. When she activated it, glowing red dots bloomed across the tenement walls from the projection and the London Exchange, Lin's Central Bank, and Tokyo's Nikkei Prototype, and Chicago Mercantile, and Wall Street, and others yet to fall. At the bottom of the map was a title, etched in precision: Financial Targets of Collapse, 2.2 Directive. When Joe arrived, still limping from the bayonet wound that shouldn't exist, he studied the map in silence. He traced a finger across the glowing projection, pausing at each city. Then, quietly, without looking up, he spoke. "They're not here to erase history this time. They're here to accelerate the fall." The second loop had begun, and it was already collapsing. Year 1, embedded. If they wanted to stop the bandits, they had to vanish. Again. Joe took a job as private security for J.P. Morgan's holdings. He wore grey suits and kept his sidearm under the desk. He never used it. He didn't have to. People feared the way he stared, like he already knew how they'd die. And when? Stacy became a switchboard operator, plugged into the lifeblood of New York's communications. She rewired the phone matrix from the inside, building a crude sub-frequency receiver that filtered 20th century static for traces of future interference. She talked to no one. Her eyes never blinked. Brian and Tommy joined the Pinkertons, dirty work in clean suits. They busted strikes, cracked skulls in soup kitchens, shook down union organizers. Sometimes the targets were bandits, sometimes not. Tommy stopped asking. Brian stopped caring. Stephanie, reborn as S.A. Carver, became a ghost in the newsroom. Her editorials shaped narratives, subtly pointing readers toward truth without triggering history's defenses. She started a column, Letters from the Edge. No one knew she meant Time's edge. They lived inside a world collapsing under its own weight, and for once, they weren't trying to fix it. They were just trying to keep it from shattering completely. Year 4, Break. It was Stacy who found it. Buried in the sub-basement of the Chrysler building, hidden behind a false wall of concrete and copper, was a bandit transmitter, lead-shielded, cooled with dry ice, wired into the building's power grid, and protected by a time-locked explosive keyed to a frequency that didn't exist yet. She traced its signal and decoded its function. Not communication, amplification. It was broadcasting despair, feeding false intel into global financial lines, tweaking stock data, manipulating perception of collapse, nudging the world toward war, chaos, and paranoia. Stephanie followed the threads. Articles in Berlin spreading fear about Jewish bankers. Pamphlets in Tokyo demonizing Western influence. A Moscow tabloid calling the Depression a Zionist experiment. All 3 editors wore French pocket watches from 1803. Stephanie smashed one on her desk, exposing a micro-transmitter carved with the bandit sigil. Joe looked at it for a long time and muttered, "Same bandit cell, beat. Different playbook, the second extraction, 1936. On a humid summer night during a rolling blackout in Manhattan, Stacy climbed the Chrysler building with a lightning rod, a copper battery pack, and no safety gear. She screamed into the storm, daring the sky to strike. It did. Lightning arced down into her rig, feeding the recall beacon. A wormhole, barely stabilized, began to open. They had 90 seconds. The team raced to the rooftop, but the bandits were waiting, 5 of them, dressed in 1930s paramilitary uniforms, but armed with tech stolen from the 23rd century. One had cybernetic eyes. Another, a pulse dagger hidden in her wrist. The fight was chaos. Joe took a bullet to the leg. Tommy lost 2 fingers trying to pry a gun from an attacker's hand. Brian disarmed a bandit, head-butted him, then threw him off the roof. Stacy finished the final activation. Her hands blistered from the heat. The beacon screamed open, a white gash in the skyline. Reality flickered like an old film reel burning. "Now!" Joe shouted, blood leaking through his suit. They jumped. The city vanished in a flash, and time, hungry as ever, devoured them whole. Chapter 5. The Third Loop. Date, January 1st, 2030. Location, Earth, United States, unaligned sovereign states, period. Arrival, red skies and silver grass. The sky was wrong. It looked like Earth. It smelled like Earth, but everything about it felt misaligned. The clouds sagged like old curtains soaked in blood and oil, low, heavy, and unnatural. They weren't drifting. They hovered, rippling in place as if tethered to something just outside the visible spectrum. Rust and violet bled across the sky in sickening pulses, like bruises trying to heal in reverse. The sun had no warmth. It glowed a deep, malignant red, fat and swollen, casting long shadows that bent at the wrong angles. The light it gave wasn't golden. It was the color of cauterized wounds, muted, angry, and exhausted. The wind stirred softly but felt wrong. It didn't whistle or howl. It slithered. It carried a metallic tang that clung to the tongue, copper and ozone, like the aftertaste of lightning or bleeding gums. There was no birdsong, no insects, no far-off engines, no distant tech hum. The world was mute, except for the gentle hiss of dust sliding over cracked concrete. Joe Burrow woke up with a start, sucking in a lungful of air that tasted like the inside of a dead battery. He was flat on his back in the middle of what had once been an interstate. The asphalt was fractured, a quilt of fissures and divots split by decades of seismic tantrums and neglect. A single faded yellow line cut through the center, flanked by shoulder weeds that shouldn't have existed. Tall blades of silver grass that shimmered like mercury and swayed without wind. He blinked against the red glare, then sat up slowly. His body creaked like old wood. The limp from 1936 was no longer an injury. It was a symmetry problem, a structural fault his body had accepted as permanent. Calcified bone wrapped around trauma. A limp etched into muscle memory and encoded into his gait like a signature. He groaned, then stood, unsteady, slower than before. His coat was torn at the collar. His boots were scorched, partially melted by the energy surge of the last jump. His fingers trembled as he reached for his chrono beacon, once sleek, now cracked and dark. He smacked it once. Twice, dead. He tapped the side of his earpiece. Static, not white noise, not signal loss, just emptiness. He looked to the sky again, then to the world below it. Across the horizon, civilization had slouched into death. Burned-out cars lined the shoulders of the highway like rusting tombs. Some were flipped, others cannibalized, stripped for wires, doors torn off, interiors hollowed and blackened. A few still had skeletons inside, most didn't. Farther down, a single billboard groaned in the breeze. Its metal frame twisted like it had been half melted and then frozen mid-collapse. Faded red paint peeled in the shape of old graffiti. Bullet holes dotted the corners like punctuation. The text read, "Welcome to the Free City of Lubbock." Population? The double question marks weren't graffiti. They were printed that way, like the city itself no longer remembered who lived there. Joe turned a slow circle. Skyscrapers, or what remained of them, lurked in the distance like giants gutted in their sleep. Most were half collapsed, leaning on each other like wounded soldiers. The steel frames had twisted in the heat. Glass had melted, then cooled into jagged fangs. One tower blinked with solar strobes, another flickered like it was mid-erasure. And the silence. Not peaceful silence, predatory silence. The kind that comes after the screaming stops but before the scavengers arrive. It filled every space, every shadow, every breath. There were no people, no voices, no children, no signs of recent life. Even the air felt abandoned. Joe didn't curse, didn't scream, didn't run. He just stood there, squinting through the haze, jaw tight. "This isn't 2030, he muttered. He had read the histories, studied the collapse, memorized every major event of the unaligned sovereign states period. But this wasn't a timeline. This was a bad copy of one. Like someone had printed the 2030s from a corrupted file. Everything was here, just off. He felt it in his spine, felt it in the way the shadows curled the wrong way, felt it in the blood rising behind his eyes. This wasn't the 2030 from the history books. This was something else, something worse. 1 week later, refugee zone, Colorado Plateau. Stephanie Karma found him first. She arrived on a gutted Greyhound bus converted into a solar-powered sandcrawler. The engine wheezed like a dying animal. Its shell was patched together with welded license plates, cardboard armor, and what looked like sheet metal stolen from a decommissioned Tesla factory. A shotgun hung above the driver's seat. Every window had been covered with rebar and duct tape. She stepped off wearing cracked aviators, military-grade boots, and a patchy coat lined with copper thread. Her hair was shorter, chopped to shoulder length. Her cheekbones looked sharper, her eyes darker, like something had been worn away. She said nothing at first, just stood there and stared at Joe. Then, "This isn't 2030 as we knew it," she said. "It's something else, something broken." The history books had spoken of food riots, digital currency collapses, and the AI insurrection in Southeast Asia. But this wasn't that. There were no crypto lords, no robot patrols, no UN peacekeepers or corporate fiefdoms. This version of 2030 had no center, no structure, just dust, silence, and signs of temporal sabotage. Cities flickered like ghost projections. Maps didn't match geography. People contradicted their own birthdays, their own hometowns. Entire communities claimed to have never heard of the internet. One village believed Lincoln was still president. "Time's corrupted," Stephanie whispered, brushing a hand through silver grass. "Someone poisoned the decade." Reunited. Within a month they found the others, each pulled in by rumors, signals, or instinct. Tommy Gallioni had been running underground fights in the Denver exclusion zone. His left hand was covered in burns, his right eye clouded from a chemical flash, but he still cracked jokes with that deadpan charm. He fought for fuel, information, and the occasional bottle of untainted whiskey. Brian Bohr had become a warlord's enforcer, somewhere along the old Route 66 corridor. He had a scar down his neck, a voice like sandpaper, and the cold, focused silence of a man who'd stopped hoping years ago. But when he saw Joe and Stephanie, he dropped the machete without a word and walked into the dust with them. Stacy Kim was last. They found her inside a scorched library in New Mexico, surrounded by cables, broken drone parts, soldered tech, and thousands of printed photographs pinned across the walls, all connected by red yarn, coordinates, and quantum equations written in lipstick on the window glass. She hadn't slept in days. "They're not sabotaging history anymore," she said, barely blinking. "They're building a new one. 2030 wasn't a broken loop. It was a foundation." Stacy's data confirmed the worst. The bandits were using this decade as a staging ground. With the world fractured and memory unstable, they were crafting a timeline from scratch, one where they could install themselves as the architects of future Earth. "It's not a heist anymore," she said. "It's a regime change. The resistance, the echoes." It was Joe who suggested they find help, What they found instead found them. They called themselves the Echoes, descendants of timeline-displaced individuals, men and women whose memories didn't match reality, people who'd been born twice, who had children that no longer existed, who remembered world wars that never happened and governments that had never fallen. They weren't soldiers, they were fractures given flesh. The team embedded with them, learned from them. Stephanie taught the Echoes how to detect historical contamination, how to read anomalies in speech patterns, how to spot false currencies, how to feel when a person didn't belong. Then Tommy and Brian trained them in close-quarters combat, taught them how to make weapons from scrap, how to bleed without screaming. And Stacy used parts from a decommissioned Chinese satellite and a rusted Tesla coil to build a quantum receiver capable of detecting echoes from possible futures. And Joe tried to believe this would end. He stopped speaking much. He carried an old notebook and filled it with names, people they'd saved, people they'd lost. Sometimes he crossed the names out, sometimes he just stared at them. Year 6, Revelation. The truth came from a place no one expected, a French time capsule, dug up near an abandoned vineyard in what was once California's wine country. Inside it, wrapped in a silk cloth and sealed with a Tac-Time vault key, was a manuscript titled Chronology Rewritten, Manifesto of the New Timeline, signed Le Premier. The document laid out the Bandits' master plan, uncorrupt the 2030s, one fracture unity before the Global Enforcement Authority can form, one discredit AI peacekeeping, one prevent the Chrono Accords of 2051, and dismantle any incentive to regulate time travel, allow rogue operatives to become temporal warlords. They're not bandits, Stephanie whispered, they're architects. But the final blow came from Stacy, who analyzed the signature on the manifesto and overlaid it with samples of Joe's old Tac-Time reports. It matched. This wasn't written by a stranger, she said. It's you. Joe didn't deny it. He just stared at the page, lips tight, eyes hollow. The third extraction. 2037. They tracked a temporal sinkhole in the ruins of what used to be Cheyenne Mountain, the old NORAD facility, now just a crater surrounded by ghost towns and barbed wire. Stacy's transmitter hummed. The window was opening, slowly but enough. Then the bandits attacked. Only this time, they didn't come to kill, they came to convert. They emerged from the smoke wearing crimson coats, faces covered in cybernetic tattoos, weapons fused with bone and metal. At their center was a man who stopped Joe cold. Scarred face, grey hair, same limp, same voice. I stayed behind, he said. I joined them, and I fixed everything you were too afraid to. It was Joe, future Joe, the one who gave up. And now he led the enemy. You failed the world once, future Joe said. I gave it order. I gave it peace. You gave it control, the real Joe growled. That's not the same thing. Then he drew his gun. The final fight. The battle was brutal, up close, no rules. Tommy was the first to fall, a bandit blade to the throat. He died choking on blood, staring at the clouds. Brian lost an arm but grabbed a pulse charge and detonated the beacon node manually, forcing the temporal window open early. Stacy screamed as her transmitter overloaded, sparking across her coat. Joe tackled his future self through a steel beam. They fought like animals, like twins, like time itself was watching. Then, Joe put the gun to his double's chest and fired once, straight through the heart. You lost the moment you gave up, he whispered. The beacon screamed open, the sky tearing sideways, swallowing them all in a blinding white arc of light and sound. Stephanie pulled Stacy to her feet. Brian dragged Joe, bleeding and breathless, to the edge. The air trembled. Jump! Someone screamed, and what was left of BRAVO1969 leapt into the storm. Again, Chapter 6. Return to the new 5555. Date 5555. Elapsed time for Earth 3 minutes, 7 seconds. Elapsed time for Team Bravo 1969, 21 years. The return, ghosts in the light. The chamber was silent when they returned. Not the sterile silence of an idle lab, not the reverent silence of an accomplished mission, but a funeral silence, one that held its breath and dared not speak. The blue flash of the chrono relay faded into a dim hum, casting flickering shadows across the chamber's reinforced titanium walls. The time tether sputtered one final note and dropped to a whisper. The smell of ozone still lingered. Dust hung frozen in midair, like it hadn't been disturbed in years, because for Earth, it hadn't. Nothing moved, no clapping, no greeting, no welcome, just blinking lights and stillness. And then the sound of knees hitting steel. Joe Burrow collapsed to the ground, gasping like the air here wasn't made for lungs that had survived 3 apocalypses. His armor, part military, part salvage, part myth, was cracked across the chest, scorched at the edges, flecked with dried blood and radioactive ash. His beard had gone grey. His eyes were sunken, bruised not by fists but by time itself. He looked like a man who had lived through 3 wars. Because he had, he didn't speak. He just placed one gloved hand on the floor, as if to make sure it was real. Stacy Kim stumbled forward next. Her left leg dragged slightly. Her right hand twitched involuntarily. Sparks hissed along the side of her skull. Her neural mesh partially fried, exposed wires blinking just beneath the surface like bioluminescent veins. Her left eye flickered, static tearing across the iris in pulses. She blinked through pain, hand on a nearby console, already scanning the room, counting threats, exits, angles. Her body was back, but her mind hadn't left the battlefield. She whispered more to herself than anyone else. Relay is stable, atmospheric pressure normal, gamma lock intact. Then a blink. We're home. But it didn't sound like relief. Stephanie Karma entered last. No stumble, no collapse, just a slow walk, boots clicking on cold metal, steady and deliberate. Her coat was a ruin of burn marks and bullet holes, its seams stitched with field thread and nanofiber tape. One sleeve was torn to the elbow, revealing a scar that hadn't been there before. In her right hand, she carried a thick, leather-bound notebook, charred around the edges, tied shut with wire. It looked ancient. It looked sacred. Inside were 7 timelines. 4 of them no longer existed. 2 had never happened. One was this one. She clutched it like a holy book, because in many ways it was. Only 3 returned. Brumbaugh was gone. His body atomized in the temporal breach. Tommy Gallioni was gone. His blood still soaked into Stephanie's notebook. They had burned, bled, and sacrificed to make this future real. And now? Now it was here. But no one was cheering. Tac-Time launch control, observation deck. Director Julius Warden was still there, still standing, still watching. But he looked less like a commander and more like a ghost that had forgotten how to haunt. His posture was stiff, like a man carved from regret. His eyes were wide behind gold-rimmed lenses. The veins in his temples pulsed in rhythm with the hum of the console beside him. He hadn't moved in 3 minutes, not even when the relay flared open. Around him, the control room was frozen in disbelief. Technicians clutched data slates, heads tilted as they tried to reconcile impossible telemetry. Their screens pulsed between real time and null time. Some whispered. Others just stared. One woman dropped her stylus and muttered, "No way. They were gone for 3 minutes." That's what the system said. 3 minutes. But Warden knew better. He looked down at Joe, and what he saw wasn't the man who'd entered the relay. This man had a different weight. He bore time like a disease, a contagion of memory. His eyes weren't looking at Warden. They were looking through him, past him, into something only survivors can see. Warden took a step closer, cleared his throat. "Report," he said softly. Joe looked up. His voice, when it came, was slow, deliberate, like it had traveled across centuries to arrive here. History tried to erase us. We didn't let it. And then he passed out. Debrief room Gamma -5, 6 hours later. The walls were sterile white. The chairs were steel. The air was cold. It wasn't a hospital. It wasn't an interrogation room. It was something worse. It was a government debrief suite, where wars became paperwork and lives became bullet points. Stacy lay on a gurney wired into a diagnostics node. Her neural interface bled code and static. Stephanie sat upright, pale but composed, flipping through her notebook like it was a lost gospel. Joe was silent, still, watching the walls like they might blink. The official report took 3 weeks, and Stacy dictated the tech specs, field calibrations, wormhole anomalies, tachyon echoes, dead loops. And then Stephanie delivered precise historical reconstructions, dates, names, newspaper headlines, secret radio transmissions. And Joe added, silence, until one sentence broke the room. There is no evidence Tac-Time ever existed, not in this version of the future. The timeline had shifted. The Global Enforcement Authority still existed. World unity still held. Order was intact. But Tac-Time gone. No surviving archive. No new recruits. No funding. No mention in any legal or academic documentation. They were ghosts now. They had never existed. The brass listened politely. They nodded. One man scratched his chin and said, fascinating. Another asked if they could be reassigned. Then they were dismissed. Just like that. Outside Tac-Time headquarters, the relay tower loomed behind them like a ruined cathedral, still intact, still humming, still dangerous, still silent. Joe stood in its shadow, hands in his coat pockets. The world around them buzzed with holographic drones, automated taxis, and civilians who didn't recognize them. Couldn't. There were no medals, no ceremony, no name plaques. A civilian transport pulled up, unmarked, plain, efficient. Stephanie leaned against the car door. We saved a future that forgot we existed. Stacy nodded. That's how you know we did it right. Joe didn't speak. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of yellowed paper. On it were 3 names, Tommy Gallioni, in Brian Bohr, and me, Joe Burrow. He took out a lighter, flicked it once, held the flame. The paper burned fast. Names turned to smoke, and Joe watched them rise, like ashes from a history no one would remember, somewhere else, deep within a server vault. The world above was calm, but below, beneath the frozen crust of the Arctic, past steel vaults and biometric locks long forgotten, a single console blinked to life. No hands touched it, no technician activated it. It woke on its own. Lines of code scrolled across a black screen. Tac-Time BRAVO1969, temporal loop closed. Mission status incomplete. Remaining anomaly detected. Location redacted. A long silence. Then a voice, smooth, synthetic but familiar. Waking echo protocol. Opening loop 4. Chapter 7. Legacy and Fallout. Date 5555. Location, Global Earth Authority Territory, various zones. Arrival, they returned to a world that remembered everything, except them. The world was intact. The skyscrapers stood, stabbing into blue skies with polished glass and digital spires. Cities buzzed with solar drones and vertical gardens. Airships drifted like clouds tethered to algorithms. Order ruled the streets, not through fear but optimization. Civil stability had become art. The oceans hadn't boiled. The polar caps still held their white crowns. Aquatic highways pulsed beneath the surface. Cargo gliders and environmental patrols ferrying across currents that hadn't turned black. The Great Barrier Reef had even regrown, according to satellite reports. The sun still rose where it should, not red, not dying, bright, sharp, golden, warming the same earth it always had. From the surface you could almost pretend nothing had ever gone wrong, and yet no one remembered BRAVO1969. Not the children in Gaul they smuggled out beneath torchlight in 1803, not the banker on Wall Street who collapsed into Joe's arms, whispering thank you in 1929, not the twin sisters from the dust cliffs of Colorado who Stephanie taught how to read using maps of a future that never came, not a single plaque, not a single photo, not a single line of historical record. Their entire existence had been rewritten, erased by the very timeline they bled to protect. What few documents still existed had been flagged as classified beyond clearance, locked under designations older than the GEA itself. What did slip through the filters had been redacted into nothing, and mission logs appeared as hypothetical simulations. Operational reports were archived under training exercises, and personnel profiles had been altered, names changed, dates shifted, outcomes unverified. One historian cited a fictional Tac-19 series in a footnote alongside Greek myths and early 21st century video games. They weren't forgotten, they were filed away on purpose. Every battle they'd fought, every wound they'd taken, every timeline they'd patched back together with blood and stubbornness, all reduced to academic guesswork and coffee break trivia. Joe Burrow was referred to as a possible inspiration for a failed military AI project. Stacy Kim was listed in one disavowed file as a theoretical neural prototype. Stephanie Karma wasn't listed at all, not even in the birth registries. They were real, but they weren't remembered. History had thanked them with silence. Not the kind of silence that mourns, the kind that buries, the kind that rewrites the eulogy before the body is cold. Inside GEA's vast civic memory repository, tens of millions of lives were stored in crystal: elections, revolutions, peace treaties, tragedies. But not Bravo. There were no voices echoing through the memory halls saying, "These are the ones who preserve the world." Instead, there was a gap, a sliver of time that scholars labeled an anomalous data recession. No one could quite explain why there were missing months in the early 2030s. No one could prove who prevented the AI sovereignty war. No one could confirm how the Louisiana Purchase had survived 3 assassination attempts in Paris. But something had happened. The timeline bore the scars, like a battlefield paved over with marble, clean, immaculate, but still hiding bones. So when Joe stepped out into the light of the new 5555 and looked up at a city that gleamed like the future they'd bled for, he felt no pride. Only absence. Not the absence of purpose, but the absence of proof. Joe Burrow, the archive ghost. He wasn't fired, because officially he'd never been gone. His Tac-Time clearance was intact. His rank remained senior operative, grade A. His service record pristine. No injuries, no citations, no field notes, because no missions existed. They reassigned him to the Global Civil Archives, a massive underground bureaucracy built into the side of what had once been the Swiss Alps. The walls were curved and chrome. The lighting was dim. Every room smelled like sterilized dust. His job? To audit scanned documents for historical redundancy violations, in other words, to erase the unproven. He didn't argue, didn't file a protest, didn't tell anyone what it meant to take a man who had killed his own future self and bury him in paperwork. He sat behind a desk that hummed like a coffin, drank black coffee that tasted like rust, filed reports that no one read, and stared at the wall like it owed him something. Every now and then, he'd reach into his pocket and pull out a burnt corner of the notebook Stephanie had carried. It was blank, but he read it anyway. Stacy Kim, the ghost in the machine. They called it routine monitoring. She called it what it was, surveillance. Her neural net was pinged every night by random security audits. Her wristpad flickered when she walked past reflective glass. Elevators paused 2 seconds longer when she stepped inside. The tech division never trusted what came back from the relay. They didn't say it aloud, but she knew the look. Is she still human? She gave them nothing. No reports, no explanations. She played dumb, pretended her migraines weren't quantum echoes, pretended she didn't hear tachyon feedback when she slept. But underground, in a forgotten service node near the city's old transit grid, Stacy built something else. A signal beacon, shielded and wired into a repurposed fusion core. It sent one pulse every 19 hours, not to satellites, not to stations, but to something else. A frequency only someone from their world would recognize. A prayer in binary, just in case Echo Protocol was more than myth. Just in case someone, anyone, was still listening. Stephanie Karma, the ghostwriter. She vanished from records within days. The Stephanie Karma who walked into the relay never existed, but someone named as Holloway enrolled in the Department of Temporal Anthropology at Stratus University. She wore glasses she didn't need, dyed her hair a soft auburn, and began publishing fiction. Her papers became digital whispers, slowly spreading through underground networks. And then chronal trauma, a narrative study of temporal dislocation. And synthetic time memory decay and false continuity. The forgotten cost of intervention, case studies in disappeared warfighters. Most dismissed them as literary metaphors. Some labeled her a conspiracy poet, others felt seen. But one piece broke the meshnet. The day the clock forgot, a memory of the team that saved time. It read like science fiction. It felt like a confession. Within hours, it had been shared across 1 billion terminals. It was banned 3 days later. That's how she knew it had worked. The first ripples. At first, it was just noise, little things, anomalies in museums, archives, fringe forums. Then came the ripples. A monastery in Nepal opened a sealed room for restoration. Inside, wall carvings of a woman with half a metallic face, kneeling beneath a flickering blue tree. The carving was dated 1456. Her features, a perfect match for Stacy Kim. In Italy, a Roman tablet was unearthed in a collapsed tomb. It depicted a man with a glowing hand standing before a crowd of warriors frozen mid-step. The inscription read, "He who speaks fire and bends the march of days." The face looked like Joe, and a forgotten fringe meshnet buried in satirical memes and conspiracy rants. A post appeared titled, "What happened to Bravo?" The replies were jokes, then trolls, then silence, until a user with no avatar and a scrambled ID replied with 2 words, "Still watching," and a GPS coordinate deep in the North Atlantic. The contact. It happened at 3:17 a.m. The city was asleep, or pretending to be. The sky above the Neozone skyline was a blur of synthetic stars and orbital debris trails, artificial constellations blinking in a rhythm no one could decipher. Traffic drones drifted between vertical towers like fireflies following invisible rails. Below, in the arterial underlayers of the city, Stacy Kim crouched beneath an old maintenance bridge, knees soaked, breath visible in the cold recycled air. The utility node she'd hijacked weeks ago had never spoken before. It simply blinked once every 19 hours, her ghost light, her signal to no one. Until now. The old receiver stuttered once, then twice. Then the light pulsed, not a beacon, not a flare, a whisper, a compressed burst hidden within waveform decay. No language, no code, just pre-language math, prime spirals, golden ratios, temporal lattice echoes. A pattern only time walkers could recognize, only she would understand. Her neural mesh surged just once, enough to cause a nosebleed. She wiped it away with the back of her hand and decoded the signal in 5 seconds. What came through chilled her deeper than any winter storm on any loop they'd ever crossed. Echo Protocol active. Remaining cell detected. At that same moment, across the city, Joe Burrow stood alone outside the old Tac-Time headquarters, now converted into a GEA administrative building labeled Temporal Resources and Risk Management. There was no signage, just a monolith of silver and black, sealed, encrypted, and forgotten. The front gate was welded shut, the retinal scanners dead, the towers hollow. Rain fell around him in hushed sheets, thick, cold, clean like it didn't belong here. Joe didn't move. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, coat drenched, looking up at the tower that had once trained them, once launched them, the tower that now sat quiet, like it had buried its own memories. He had been there every night for a week, just watching, just waiting. Then his comm unit buzzed. One short ping, he blinked, checked the screen. No sender ID, no header data, just a single message displayed in old world courier font. One line, "La Première is still alive." Joe stared at it for a long time. Then he smiled, not a happy smile, a tired one, the kind of smile you wear when an old enemy finally speaks your name again. He whispered into the rain, "Well, I guess it's not over." Then he turned toward the shadows and vanished. Arrival, the new mission. They met in Dome 9, deep beneath the old Tac-Time training complex. Officially, the dome had been decommissioned in 5483. Unofficially, it had been forgotten, left to rot behind welded blast doors and defunct clearance protocols, buried beneath 1,000 bureaucratic repurposings and 10,000 feet of data silence. A training simulation chamber once used to build the world's most precise time operatives, now reclaimed by dust, rust, and memory. The door hissed open only after Stephanie Karma rewired the entry node by hand, stripping back insulation, patching burnt lines, and inserting a ghost circuit made from old signal latches and a cracked fusion cap she'd scavenged from a university lab basement. The outer airlock opened slowly, metal grinding like it had forgotten how to breathe. Inside, the chamber was dead. The holoprojectors had long since blown. The once pristine sim floor was cracked and pitted, covered in moss-colored film and abandoned calibration gear. Cables hung like vines from the ceiling. A broken drone unit blinked feebly in one corner, its motion sensors confused, its purpose extinct. But it was still home. The three of them stepped inside and said nothing for a long time. They sat in the center of the chamber, on the cold floor where hundreds of missions had begun and dozens of operatives had broken or bled or become something less than human. It should have felt like a reunion. Instead, it felt like an exhumation. Joe Burrow leaned back against a fractured pillar, his coat patched with burn marks and field thread. A scar ran along his jaw, faint but twitching now that the dome's atmosphere conditioning was kicking in. He looked older than the war they'd fought, like time had turned him into its own failed prototype. But his hands were steady, his eyes were clear, and there was something iron in his silence. And Stacy Kim sat cross-legged across from him, legs folded beneath her, in that deliberate, calculated way that suggested her spinal mesh was still adjusting to the dome's interference field. Her left eye flickered with a halo of blue static, reacting to old frequencies still embedded in the walls. She didn't hide it anymore. The glitch had become her fingerprint, her badge of survival. She was thinner now, sharper, but no less lethal. And Stephanie Karma was the last to sit. She moved like someone carrying weight, though the only thing in her hands was a new notebook, hand-bound, pages yellowed with chemical treatment to mimic old-world paper. The notebook was already half full, with timelines, names, dates, some true, some not yet. She placed it gently beside her knee, then looked at the other two. "Same floor," she said. "Different war." Joe said nothing. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a single sheet of rough off-grid paper, unfolded it, flattened it against the sim floor. There were only 3 names on it, each written in his precise military handwriting, and one word at the top, underlined twice. Echo. He slid the list forward between them. It didn't matter who read it first. They all knew what it meant. A new directive. Unapproved, unauthorized. But real. I don't care what the GEA says, Joe said quietly. They forgot us. But Time didn't. Stephanie reached into her coat, pulled out a cigarette from a case that hadn't seen daylight in 20 years, and lit it with a spark from her wrist pad. She didn't inhale. She didn't even like the taste. But the ritual, the smoke, it made her feel like she was choosing to remember. We always knew we wouldn't get thanked, she said, letting the ash fall on the cold floor. I just didn't think we'd be erased. Stacy leaned forward and opened the hatch on her modified beacon core, still damaged from 2037, still glitching around the edges. She'd carved the activation rune herself, in a language no one spoke anymore. One touch, a soft hum, the signal fired, encrypted, silent, echo protocol reinitialized. The beacon's pulse matched the dome's flickering light, 1 beat per second, a countdown but not to a mission. To war, no fanfare, no hierarchy, no command structure, just 3 broken ghosts sitting in the ruins of their old world, deciding the job wasn't finished. They didn't salute, didn't say oaths, didn't cry. They just activated. Across the dome, the power surged, dimly at first, then brighter. Old circuits remembered their pulse. SIM nodes blinked awake in patterns not seen since the relay first opened. And the simulation floor lit up with the last scenario ever run before decommission. Objective, stop la premiere. Status, incomplete. Operator count, 3. Echo, active. The countdown began again. And this time it was personal. Elsewhere, unknown location, in a chamber deep beneath the ice shelf, far from satellite orbit or surveillance drones, a cryopod hissed. Steam curled in coils. Light flickered across frozen glass. Le Premier opened his eyes. He stepped out barefoot, breath fogging the air. Around him, walls of analog maps, scorched notebooks, frozen DNA samples, and a massive globe, spinning slowly, marked with colored pins and chronal scars. He walked toward a vault, past a sealed case marked Red Coat Protocol Phase 2. He opened it. Inside, neatly folded, was a crimson coat. He smiled. They came back, he said, voice like gravel and rain. Good. Behind him, the globe flickered. 1 dot glowed red. Loop 4 active. Target unknown. Resistance online. Chapter 8. The First Paradox War. Date 5556. Location classified temporal zone, Earth, unknown alternate timeline. They always believed the worst was behind them. That was the lie time tells. The lie whispered in debriefing rooms and between missions. The lie wrapped in medals and archived in black vaults. The lie Joe had once told himself when he looked in the mirror and said, "We made it," because time, real time, doesn't move forward like a river. It doesn't trickle into the past and vanish behind memory. Time circles. It loops, folds, and frays. It stalks the things that try to escape it. It punishes those who dare to reshape it. And worst of all, time remembers, not like people do, not with nostalgia or grief, but with calculation. Time is not a wound, it's a weapon. And every loop they closed, every fracture they sealed, every anomaly they buried beneath code and sacrifice, it all came back. Not as ghosts, but as echoes with teeth. They had believed that once the mission was done, once the beacon was silent and the loops were closed, they could disappear into the world they saved. Live quiet lives, fade into myth, maybe heal, but time doesn't heal, it settles scores. And the score from BRAVO1969 was still open, because they had won, yes, but only in the version of reality they could see. What they never asked was, what else changed? Who else remembered? And what happens when the enemy isn't from the past, but from a future where you lost? Because time doesn't forget, and neither did Le Premier, the first strike. It began, as endings sometimes do, with a murder. Dr. Lannis Crowe was not a target anyone would expect, just a mid-tier gear archival compliance officer. She specialized in old records, irregular audits, birth discrepancies, paper cuts and pensions. She was found dead in her apartment. No forced entry, no bruises, no blood, no motive. Just one anomaly. Her heart had stopped 5 minutes before she was born. Not figuratively, chronologically. When her body arrived at the morgue, the attending coroner watched in horror as her cellular tissue aged backward. Her fingerprints faded, her teeth receded, her bones softened. By the time an autopsy could be conducted, she was the size of a fetus. She had died out of order. 2 days later, a Tac-Time vault in Oslo, one of the few still known to exist, collapsed inward. Not an explosion. Not sabotage. It imploded, like a crushed soda can hit by gravity from 6 different centuries. Inside that vault had been relics from the lost Baghdad loop of 4,850, chronal crystals, waveform fossils, kinetic memory logs. Gone. In their place sat a single yellowed envelope, no security trace, no time signature, handwritten on the front, Joe Burrow. Inside, one piece of paper, ink scrawled with chilling elegance. You never left. Le Premier. Echo protocol activated. Back in Dome 9, the ruins had grown functional, and power had been stabilized, and surveillance lines rerouted, and signal dampeners installed. For the last 9 months, Joe, Stacy, and Stephanie had rebuilt it, not as a command center, but as a war bunker, a temporal triage station, a lighthouse for lost time. They'd been tracking anomalies, ripples that grew deeper, wider, and more frequent. Entire digital archives began shimmering, blinking like corrupted data, as though history itself was gasping for breath. One GEA archive listed 5 different outcomes for the Cuban crisis of 2222. A historical AI wrote a thesis on the fall of Rome in 1983. A preschooler in Seoul drew a star map of stars that hadn't formed yet. Echo protocol was activated, and it told them the truth they hadn't dared say aloud. The timeline wasn't stable, it never had been. Every paradox they'd sealed had only pushed the instability somewhere else, like sealing cracks in glass underwater. And then the doubles appeared. Joe's first was a 13-year-old boy, exact DNA match, born in 2 sovereign zones on the same day. No parents in common, no shared memories, same face, same walk. Stacy's duplicate was harder to find. She existed in a timeline that had supposedly collapsed in 4,999. A woman in her 50 leading a quantum weapons firm, speaking at a conference that hadn't been scheduled in this loop. Stephanie's shook them most. A banned manifesto from 60 years ago surfaced on the dark meshnet, The Lie of the Line, by S.C. Holloway. It described time not as a river, but as a knife. It wasn't meant to flow, it was meant to cut. Stitching timelines is not preservation, the author wrote. It's surgery without anesthesia, the war no one sees. The Paradox War didn't start with an explosion. It didn't come with flags or factions. It came with fractures. Temporal agents began hunting versions of themselves, operatives sent back to intercept deviations only to become deviations. Whole cities woke up with altered architecture. Governments received letters from leaders who had never ruled, and diplomats began quoting wars that had never happened. And children were born with memories of lifetimes they hadn't lived. One woman in Jakarta recited her own funeral rites in Latin, a language she never learned, for a death that hadn't occurred. And in one chilling case, a child soldier, no older than 10, walked into a GEA checkpoint, carrying a Tac-Time insignia, from a mission that had never been authorized. GEA denied it all. No press releases, no public warning. They labeled it software contamination, But Bravo 1969 knew better, because they weren't part of GEA anymore. They were ghosts watching from the edges. For every paradox they closed, another grew, like rot under polished floors, and through it all something whispered beneath the hum of linear logic. You're not fixing the timeline. You're defending the wrong one. The collapse at Istanbul. They tracked the signature to a floating black market data ring tethered above the ruins of time-locked Istanbul, a temporal quarantine zone sealed since the chrono collapse of 5290. Entry was forbidden. Maps glitched when you tried to chart it. AI systems refused to acknowledge it existed. Inside, a temporal bazaar unlike anything they'd ever seen, and stolen timelines for sale by the decade, and memories extracted from people who never lived. Entire banned events compressed into portable loops for elite collectors. In the back, past a vault coded in prehistoric DNA, Stephanie found herself. Not a double, not a clone. Herself. Same body. Same scar on the left wrist. Same notebook. Same half-burnt page from the day Tommy died. But this Stephanie had stayed in 1936. She had chosen to wait. He told me to, she said, eyes full of decades. Joe, he said, the future needed more than one of me, Le Premier's broadcast. It happened at exactly 11:11 UTC on every synchronized system across the planet. It wasn't a transmission, it was a seizure. Every screen blinked to black, every neural implant stuttered, every synced AI froze mid-command. For 7 seconds, time fractured. Not symbolically, visibly. People saw themselves grow old and die. Children screamed at flashes of lovers they hadn't met. A woman leapt from a bridge after seeing a future she couldn't bear. A man in Berlin knelt sobbing, whispering to a dead wife he hadn't married yet. Then came the face, Le Premier. Joe's face, but older, eyes hollow, skin stretched thin, like time had worn him down to wire and vengeance. He spoke without moving his lips. You tried to hold the line, but time doesn't want to be held. The past was never yours, the future is already mine. And the signal ended. Just like that. The last orders. After the broadcast, Joe sat alone in Dome 9. He didn't speak, didn't move, didn't blink. For 1 hour, he stared at the flickering echo screen. The names, the loops, the last stable checkpoint. The others waited. Finally, Joe stood. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. He just said it. We end him, that was the order. There was no strategy session, no vote, no approval needed. Stephanie didn't ask how. She lit a cigarette. Stacy didn't ask when. She was already packing her gear. Because this wasn't about restoring history anymore. This was about choosing a version of reality worth dying for, and making damn sure theirs was the one left standing. Chapter 9. The Echo Protocol. Date unknown. Location outside linear time. Echo Vault 0. The place that shouldn't exist. It started with a pulse. Just a flicker. A heartbeat in the silence of space-time. An empty coordinate in the chrono grid. A coordinate that had always returned null, always, across every map, every scan, every attempt. And then it wasn't null anymore. Stacy Kim saw it first. She was combing through fractured telemetry logs from the Istanbul collapse, mapping the ghost resonance patterns from Le Premier's broadcast. The coordinates blinked into view for exactly 0.38 seconds, a fixed location, outside any registered event horizon, a place that had never existed, and now always had. She froze. Her fingers hovered over the console as sweat formed on her neck despite the cryo-cool chamber around her. This isn't a jump echo, she whispered. It's a breach anchor. Joe Burrow leaned in behind her, reading the data over her shoulder with haunted precision. That's not just a footprint, he said. That's someone kicking down the door. Not in the past, not in the future, but in something worse, memory. They traced the signal's point of origin to what had once been Singapore. now known only in restricted GEA records as the null zone, a cratered temporal scar surrounded by unmapped chronal interference, avoided even by automated probes. At its heart, they found a sinkhole, a gravity pit swallowing history itself. Below it, buried beneath strata of paradox compression, was a single vault, sealed with a code keyed to 3 biometric signatures. Echo Protocol, authorized, BRAVO1969. The door opened before they touched it. The Vault of Echoes. They entered Echo Vault 0. There was no gravity, no sound, no heat, only the faint taste of copper in their mouths, and the primal ache of knowing they shouldn't be here. The interior of the vault was lined with mirrored walls, but they weren't reflective in any normal sense. These weren't mirrors, they were windows. Versions, refracted timelines etched into quantum substrate, each pane of glass its own impossibility. Stacy floated past one where she had aged into a grey-haired woman teaching future generations to build wormholes out of song. Joe stared at a version of himself in geo-regalia, handcuffed, on trial for crimes against time itself. Stephanie moved slowly, her eyes fixed on a reflection of her commanding an army of time walkers wearing blood-red gloves. She was issuing a kill order to a man, Joe, but not their Joe. This one had no scar, no limp. His eyes were blank. "I think this place stores what could have been," Stephanie murmured. "No," Joe said. "It's what we almost were." He moved past a mirror that showed him kissing a woman in a field of silver grass, her face unfamiliar yet intimate. He blinked. For a moment he remembered her name. He had never met her, but he had. Somewhere. Their minds began to fray, memories flickering like a damaged film reel, thoughts bleeding together, versions of themselves merging, then pulling apart. Stacy dropped to her knees, whispering coordinates from timelines that had never stabilized. Her neural mesh spasmed against the paradox weight. Her voice glitched, first English, then French, then something outside language. "There's a version of me who never left, 20, 30, she said. She stayed, she taught, she married, she blinked. I remember it like it was mine." Joe reached out and touched one of the mirrors. It was warm. "This is what Le Premier meant," he said. "He's not just rewriting time, he's editing us, the broken timeline map." They followed the final corridor through the vault, a path lined with flickering projections of decaying clocks and languages that no longer had alphabets. At the end, sealed behind a door labeled in chrono-suppressive script, they found the vault's core. There it floated, a sphere suspended in zero-G stasis, rotating slowly, dimly lit from within, like a dying sun made of code and regret. Its surface shimmered, not with light, but with shifting layers of temporal residue, dust from timelines that had once existed and been discarded like failed drafts of a story too dangerous to finish. At first glance it looked inert, a relic, but then it shuddered, and with it, they felt it, the pull. Not gravity, but something worse, recognition. "It's calling us," Stacy said, her voice low. "No," Stephanie replied, "it's remembering us." The sphere wasn't a map, not in any conventional sense. There were no coordinates, no roads, no X and Y plots of time. Instead, it layered. Shells, not strands. Chrono-onion universes, stacked and stacked, each one a version of existence built on top of another. Not separate timelines, but recurring overwrite events, each iteration suppressing the last like a city paving over its ancient ruins. Joe approached first. His footsteps slowed as he neared it, the skin on his hands tingling with interference. The sphere responded to him. Its shell cracked open briefly, revealing inner layers lit with strange symbols and glitches of memory. Inside the layers they saw fragments, a cathedral built in orbit around a black hole, a child playing with a clockwork device that whispered his name, versions of themselves at war with themselves. "This isn't just a model," Stacy murmured, initiating a scan. "It's a record of every iteration, every overwrite, every false fix." The scan came back as corrupted strings, lines of recursive glyphs flickering and collapsing into themselves, impossible to fully translate. Stacy ran the quantum filter anyway, and one message burned through the noise, burned into their retinas like an afterimage. Original continuum, suppressed. The words echoed in the vault with the weight of finality. Joe's jaw locked, his hands curled into fists, white-knuckled, shaking with pressure. "That's our home," Stacy said. "Buried." Stephanie's voice was hollow, not erased, not broken, just smothered. It hit them in waves, every mission, every jump, every timeline they'd corrected. They hadn't been repairing the past. They'd been sealing someone else's edits, like painting over a stolen mural, Stephanie said, one layer at a time, until nothing true remains. Joe stepped closer to the sphere. His reflection fractured across its mirrored surface, splitting him into dozens of versions, each one reaching for the center. "We're walking someone else's blueprint," Stacy whispered. "And now he wants to overwrite the last one," Stephanie finished. Joe raised his hand, pressed it against the outer shell. The moment his palm made contact, the sphere pulsed. Once. Not like a machine. Like a heartbeat. And then it stopped. Frozen. Waiting. "It knows we're here," Joe whispered. "And it remembers everything we forgot. The truth about Le Premier." At the back of the vault, behind a locked alcove protected by recursive encryption, they found a personnel record. No labels, just a file cluster titled Project Red Thread, Subject Chrono-Operative Number 1, Name Joseph E. Burrow Original, Status Active, Location Unbound. Stephanie read it aloud, but it was Joe who went pale, who staggered, who understood before she reached the end. Le Premier wasn't just a future version of him. He wasn't the first to fall. He was the first to go. The first to travel, the first to loop, the first to dive so deep into time that he forgot who he was and became someone else. "He didn't lose his mind," Joe said softly. "He lost his identity and built a new one in the silence. He'd looped so many times, changed so many versions of himself, that eventually he stopped being Joe at all and became Le Premier. And now, Joe wasn't just hunting the enemy. He was hunting his own shadow, the final directive. They were almost gone. The vault's systems had begun to collapse the moment they accessed the core, a slow degradation, like time itself wanted the place to vanish now that its secrets had been spilled. Glitches shimmered along the mirrored walls. The air grew thinner, the temperature shifting unpredictably. Joe was already prepping the jump gate. Stephanie was rearming the beacon failsafe. Stacy lagged behind. Something pulled at her attention. Then the panel opened, without sound, without motion, just a soft click, like a throat clearing in a church. A small square in the floor slid back, revealing a single worn audio node nestled in protective foam. Its casing was old, pre-standard Tac-Time tech, early generation, handmade. It blinked once. "Guys," Stacy called, but they'd already stopped moving. Stephanie turned first, a flicker of dread passing through her face, recognition before action. "That model's obsolete," she said. "Gia stopped using those before we even started training." Joe approached slowly, crouched beside Stacy. He gave a small nod. "That's not for us," he said. "It's from us." Stacy touched the node. It whirred to life. A voice played, familiar, wounded, brave. To fix the line, it said, "One of you must end the loop. One of you must never return." Stephanie flinched, because it was her voice, not quite hers, but close enough to hurt. It had her cadence, her warmth, even her breathing pattern. But it was older, ragged, a version of her that had made it through something terrible, left this message behind, and died for it. A ghost of a ghost. "That's me," she said quietly. "But not me. Another iteration," Joe said. "Another try. A warning," Stacy added. "Or a eulogy." The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind of silence that bends the rules of time, where seconds feel like minutes, where everything waits to see what you'll do. They were standing in a tomb of maybe realities, surrounded by mirrored echoes of themselves, successes and failures, betrayals and sacrifices. Some of those versions had made the same discovery. Others had never gotten this far. Now it was their turn. Stacy's beacon began to glow again, its light cutting across the fractured room. The coordinates were already entered. She hadn't done it. Neither had Joe. And Stephanie hadn't touched it, but the coordinates were set. A single-use jump, one way, not to the beginning, but to the fracture point. The event horizon of the timeline collapse, the place where all paths diverged, the place where one decision would either seal the continuum or shatter it forever. Joe looked at Stephanie, his eyes full of memories they'd never shared. Stephanie looked at Joe. Her mouth opened, closed, nothing came out, and neither of them looked at Stacy, because they didn't need to, because they already knew. She was holding the beacon. The jump was keyed to her DNA. The message had been left for her. One of you must never return. Stacy stared down at her own reflection, fractured 100 times in the mirrored walls, each version of her staring back, some crying, some screaming, some at peace. "I'm the constant," she said finally. "I always was. I'm the one who remembers." Joe stepped forward. "You don't have to." "I already did, Joe," she cut him off. "In one of these mirrors? I already made the jump." Stephanie reached for her but stopped short. There was nothing to say, only the final weight of understanding. One of them would become the loop breaker, and the others would forget her the moment she left. Stacy stepped onto the platform, her silhouette illuminated by the failing light of 100 dying versions of time. "I'm not afraid," she said, "but I hope you remember me anyway." Joe raised his hand in silent salute. Stephanie blinked hard and nodded once. The beacon flared, white light ripping through the vault like a scream of birth. And then Stacy was gone, just gone. No trail, no echo, no goodbye. Just two ghosts remaining in a room full of mirrors, and one fracture still waiting to be healed. Chapter 10. Full Circle. The Final Jump. Date, May 1st, 1803. Location, Louisiana Territory, edge of the Mississippi River. Operation code, return to origin. They landed hard, not like the sleek insertions they'd trained for, not like the clean temporal transitions that shimmered with stabilizing pulses and redundant reality checks. This was a shatter drop. Joe and Stephanie slammed into the earth like they'd been ripped through time by a god that had finally run out of patience. The air around them sizzled, burnt ozone, static charge, and the smell of river mud. The beacon fizzled in Joe's hand, its frame cracked, bleeding sparks. That was it. One jump left, no way home. But they were exactly where they needed to be. The hinge, May 1st, 1803, the day the Louisiana Purchase was finalized. "This isn't just where we started," Stephanie said, pulling herself to her feet, wincing as her knee popped. "It's where he started, too." They were surrounded by a thicket of trees just east of the Mississippi, wild and untouched, untamed, no railroads, no buildings, just the pulse of a continent not yet claimed. And in the distance, the tent camp of the French negotiators. Their torches glowed faintly against the morning mist. Somewhere beyond them, Thomas Jefferson's envoys waited, ready to make the deal that would double the size of the United States. But Joe wasn't looking at the diplomats. He was staring at the river, at the reflection standing across from him, down by the bank. A man, older, weathered, scarred by time in ways the body wasn't meant to hold. Same height, same build, same face. But the eyes were wrong. "Le Premier," Stephanie said, breath-catching. "No," Joe whispered. "Me." The older version stood with perfect calm, wearing a faded Tac-Time field coat marked with no insignia. His hands were folded behind his back like a statue carved from guilt. "I knew you'd follow the thread," he said, voice smooth as eroded stone. I left the echo vault open for a reason. Joe took a step forward, heart pounding with a rhythm he couldn't control. Why here? Because here is the first fracture, the first rewrite, the beginning of the cascade. We stopped the French bandits. We held the line. You think you did, Le Premier replied, eyes narrowing. But the line doesn't end, it curves. And the loop always resets unless someone cuts it at the root. Behind them, the wind shifted. The sun rose just a little too fast, time itself hiccuping like a system under strain. Stephanie reached for her scanner, but it blinked null. Something's wrong, she muttered. Reality's not syncing right. There's too much pressure on the moment. Le Premier nodded solemnly. Because this isn't a mission anymore, he said. It's a test, a judgment call, and I've made mine. From beneath his coat he pulled something small, a beacon core, cracked like theirs, but humming, pulsing with active charge. I'm going to make sure it never happens, Joe. No more Tac-Time, no more vaults, no loops, no wars. No you. By killing me? Joe asked. No, he said. By erasing everything. And just like that, the final enemy revealed itself. Not foreign, not a terrorist cell, not a rogue nation with stolen tech. It was himself. The man who had lived too long, saved too much, watched the world rewrite itself until there was nothing left of the truth. The paradox didn't live in time. It lived in memory, and Le Premier remembered everything. Joe drew his sidearm. Stephanie stepped beside him. The timeline cracked in the sky above them, fractals of light curling like veins across the clouds. We finish this, she said. No, Joe said, locking eyes with himself. We break it, the shadow of himself. Location, French Governor's Mansion, Louisiana Territory, 1803. Time, 6:47 a.m. The mansion sat like a ghost on the edge of history, forgotten by time but untouched by rot. A rotunda of pale stone and timber beams, its domed ceiling cracked from centuries of neglect that hadn't happened yet. Joe stepped through the threshold first, pistol drawn, eyes sharp. Stephanie followed, slower, more cautious. Her fingers hovered near her pulse beacon, ready to detonate the last tether if things fractured beyond control. The room was silent. Dust hung like fog, caught in frozen sunbeams cutting through shattered windows. And then they saw him, Le Premier, standing in the center of the rotunda beneath the stained glass eye of a forgotten empire. Alone, waiting, no guards, no traps, just him, same face, same shoulders, same jawline. But everything else had changed. His hair was grayer, slicked back like polished regret. His eyes, they didn't just look old, they looked hollowed out. Like every timeline he'd lived had carved a trench behind his pupils. He wore deep crimson, the kind of red that wasn't dyed. It was burned into the fabric. Time-worn armor fused to his chest, shoulders and spine. 29th century tech glowing faintly with rhythmic pulses, a dead man's heartbeat on repeat. His voice was calm, measured, like a priest offering last rites. You don't have to stop me, he said. You've already lost. Joe didn't lower the weapon. He didn't blink. He took one step forward. No, Joe said, jaw tight. I just finally understand. Le Premier tilted his head slightly, a faint smile, not mocking, not cruel, merciful, like a man looking at a version of himself he pitied. Then you know this isn't conquest, he said. It's euthanasia. Joe's grip tightened. You forgot what we were fighting for. I didn't forget, Le Premier said softly. I remembered too much. He walked slowly around the center of the room, each step measured, like the floor might betray him. I've lived through 19 collapses, he continued. I've watched the line tear itself apart, over and over. Every version of reality ends in rot, in blood, in silence, echo after echo after echo. So you decided to become God? Stephanie asked, her voice sharp. To choose the final version? No, the Premier said. "I became the editor." He paused under the cracked dome, looking up at the fading sky beyond the glass. "There is no clean timeline, Joe. There's no perfect past. We've just been stitching rags to keep the corpse breathing. I gave it a mercy it never deserved." Joe stepped closer. The gun still didn't waver, but his voice cracked now, just slightly. "You stopped believing in people." "No," the Premier said. "I stopped believing in us. In Tac-Time. In the arrogance that we were fixing something." "We were," Joe insisted. "We are. Every child we saved, every war we prevented, every fracture we sealed, delayed the inevitable," Le Premier interrupted. "You're holding sand and pretending it's concrete." There was silence, the kind that only falls between two men who both know they're right and know one of them has to die. Stephanie stepped in now, voice lower, like she was talking to a wounded animal. "Why now? Why here?" "Because this is where you believed," he said. "This was the moment it all started, the myth of preservation, the lie of the line. If I erase it, erase us, then the universe finally gets to be what it wants." Joe's voice dropped, almost a whisper. "And what's that?" "Free," Le Premier said. He opened his hand. A pulse detonator blinked twice. Behind them the air shivered. A temporal rift was forming. Crude, violent, unstable. "If I trigger this, everything collapses," Le Premier said. "No more Tac-Time, no more wars. Just entropy. Pure, clean." "And if I shoot you?" Joe asked. "Then you become me," Le Premier said, turning to face him fully, "and it starts all over again." His eyes softened. "But I hope you don't—" "Why?" Stephanie asked. "Because even now, I still want to believe you're better than I became, and for one impossible moment." Joe didn't know if he was. The fight for the future. Location, French governor's mansion, temporal fracture point, time, all of them, and none. The battle didn't begin with a shout. It began with a glitch. Reality hiccuped, light warped. The floor fractured into a dozen versions of itself, marble, wood, ash, sand. Then came the first shot. Joe fired, sent a mass. Le Premier twisted just enough for the pulse round to sear his shoulder instead of his heart. The wound sizzled with time static, oozing a strange golden plasma that shimmered like dying starlight. His reply was brutal, a backhand strike that cracked air like thunder and sent Joe skidding across the shifting rotunda floor. "Every strike you land," Le Premier growled, "dooms another version of yourself." Stacy flanked left, beacon in one hand, pulse blade in the other. The blade hummed, a living shard of entropy, forged from quantum threads only she understood. It changed shape mid-swing, adapting to whatever year the floor happened to be in. Time stuttered around her. She cut through a Napoleonic chandelier that reformed into a floating drone as it hit the ground. Stephanie moved with precision. No weapons, just awareness. She whispered false history into the fabric of reality. "We already won in 2141. You surrendered in Berlin 2037. We buried you in Kansas 1912, and time believed her." For moments Le Premier faltered, confused, whole seconds rewritten mid-step. Then came the collapse. Gunshots echoed into future wars. Each bullet that missed splintered through history, becoming assassinations, riots, revolutions, echoes that would someday kill people who hadn't even been born yet. Blood spilled that erased children from memory. Stephanie saw a boy's face flash before her eyes, one she didn't recognize, but her heart broke like she'd loved him once. And just like that, he was gone. Unborn, unremembered. Buildings flickered in and out of visibility, alive, ruined, never built. The rotunda became a time sieve. Walls shifted between empires and ruins, and brick turned to steel, unstone to glass, and columns to collapsed beams. It existed in a dozen versions at once, all screaming for dominance. Horses turned into hovercraft and back again. 2 French guards burst into the room with muskets, only to glitch into cybernetic enforcers riding chrome hover rigs, then blink out like bad dreams. Stacy was everywhere at once. The beacon fed her temporal threading, alternate versions of her own fight, unfolding simultaneously. In one flicker, she stabbed Le Premier through the ribs. In another, she was already dead. In a third, she screamed and vanished, nothing but ash. She focused on the one thread that still held. The blade found its mark, ripping through the enhancements on Le Premier's thigh. Sparks flew. Metal screamed. "This blade's set to the end of time," she said, gasping. "You can't outlast it." Le Premier knocked her across the room with a shockwave of raw chronal force. Joe rose slowly, blood on his lips. His pistol was gone. All he had left were his hands, and the anger of 100 broken loops. "This ends now," he whispered. "This never ends," Le Premier said. They met like twin storms. Fist met fist. The sound cracked the dome. Time shivered. Glass broke 3 times before hitting the ground once. Paradox versus guilt. Joe fought with raw emotion. Every punch was for the friends he'd lost. Every kick for the lives Le Premier erased. But Le Premier knew his moves. He anticipated each strike half a second before it landed. "I remember this," he said. "I lived this. You don't win." Joe feinted a jab, switched stance, elbow to the ribs, knee to the chin, a headbutt from a timeline where Tac-Time taught dirty tricks. "I don't have to win," Joe spat, catching his breath. "I just have to make you remember." And then he said it. Words whispered not in defiance but in heartbreak. "I remember what you gave up." Le Premier froze. His stance faltered. The weight of all his choices pulled at his spine like gravity. The woman, the mission, the first timeline, the last goodbye. "You buried her in Rome," Joe said. "You never went back." Le Premier's lip trembled, just once. And that's when Stephanie struck, a perfectly timed misdirection. She whispered, "We never buried her. She's alive in thread 7. And Time believed her again." Le Premier's enhancements blinked in confusion. His armor hesitated. His thoughts fractured. Joe surged forward, fist clenched with something stronger than anger, remorse, and drove it straight into his future self's chest. The rotunda exploded, but not outward, inward. Time folded like paper, threads unraveled. Joe grabbed Stephanie's hand. Stacy hit the beacon's trigger. The world collapsed into light. The loop ends here. Location, temporal collapse zone, governor's mansion core. Time, -0, beyond the loop. Joe stood at the heart of the unraveling. The detonator sat in his palm, no bigger than a coin, glowing faintly with cold blue light. It pulsed like a heartbeat from a timeline long buried. The core wasn't a bomb in the traditional sense. It wouldn't incinerate matter or fracture buildings. It would erase echoes, every duplicate, every recursion, every tangled loop that had spun their lives into spirals of pain and contradiction. It would all end here, not through violence, but through choice, clean, brutal, honest. Joe stared at it for a long moment. "One activation," Stacy said. "That's all it takes." The air around them shimmered with instability, walls phasing through centuries, light fracturing into prisms of memories they hadn't lived. Joe saw versions of himself flicker through the broken reality, one where he never joined Tac-Time, one where he died in Istanbul, and one where he married her, one where he was Le Premier. "If we all go back," Stacy said quietly, beacon still glowing in her trembling hand, "the loop resets. The recursion wins. All of this repeats." Stephanie looked around the rotunda-turned collapse hub. Mirrors of themselves stared back through fragmented time. Some smiled, others screamed. One version of Joe stood alone, forever silent, like a tombstone in red. "Someone has to seal it from inside," she said, barely audible. Joe nodded once, slowly, not a martyr's nod, not a hero's. Just a man who finally understood the weight of all his decisions. "I was the one who started this," he said. "You didn't know," Stephanie said, reaching for him. He stepped back gently. "But I do now. And then, he smiled. Not a smirk, not the weary grin of a soldier. A real smile, the first in years. The kind of smile a man gives when he knows he's righting the original wrong. Joe turned to Stacy and Stephanie, eyes gleaming through the tremors of time collapse. Tell them we never gave up. Not once. Joe, Stacy began. No goodbye speeches, he cut in gently. I've heard enough of those in 1,000 timelines. He handed Stacy a data key. Burn it into the beacon, every truth we uncovered. Make it matter. Stephanie's voice broke. There has to be another way. Joe glanced around at the chaos, the flickering futures, the bleeding past, the fractured now. There was another way. We lived it. Over and over. He looked at the detonator. Now it's time to stop. He turned his back on them, walking into the center of the breach, where reality had come undone like a slit in a page. Each step echoed like a drumbeat across fractured time. He knelt, placed the detonator on the temporal scar, and activated the sequence. The light changed. Time gasped. The loops began to collapse inward, each version of Joe blinking out, one by one, like stars winking out at the end of the universe. Joe didn't look back. This isn't the end, he whispered to no one. It's the beginning we never got. And then, he was gone. The loop sealed. Time flowed for the first time in millennia. Goodbye. Location, collapse site, the beacon ring. Time, final countdown, +07. The ring stood silent before ignition, humming with the quiet terror of what it was built to do. 12 monoliths, curved in a circle of ancient alloy and quantum circuitry, flickered with collapsing energy, like tombstones trying to remember what they once marked. Joe stepped into the center of the beacon ring. Not marching, not rushing, just walking, calm, resolved. Stacy stood at the control post, fingers trembling as she entered the jump coordinates. They weren't to a destination. Not really. More like a scar in the universe. One final thread that had to be clipped by a hand that remembered how it was sewn. Behind her, Stephanie keyed in the kill code. Her fingers paused once. Not out of hesitation, out of grief. She was writing an ending, and she had spent years praying she'd never have to. The ring lit up with searing white-blue arcs, wrapping around Joe like the arms of a collapsing god. He looked at them both, his only family left in the universe. Eyes alive with fractured memory, with guilt, with peace. Tell them, Joe said, voice calm above the hum of dying time. We lost 21 years. He smiled, just a little. That half-smile they knew so well. But we didn't waste a second. The charge reached critical. Joe's form dissolved into vectors of light, atoms splitting along multiple timelines, memories breaking into photons. He didn't scream. He didn't flinch. He just vanished, swallowed by the core, unwritten by choice, burned into history by will, just like the first time. But this time, he didn't come back. Not as a paradox, not as a ghost, not as Le Premier. Just silence. The ring dimmed. The beacon went cold, and the world, for the first time in 2 decades, held still. Stacy dropped her hands. Stephanie closed the notebook. Neither one spoke. They didn't have to, because this wasn't goodbye. It was the ending he chose. 6. The aftermath. Date, May 1st, 5555. Location, New Earth, Temporal Zone 0. Designation, Post-Loop Continuum. Stacy and Stephanie collapsed onto the scorched earth of the return site, surrounded by silence so thick it felt unnatural. Not broken, not post-apocalyptic, just still. No alarms, no beacon pulses, no temporal interference. The world was stable. The sun rose exactly where it should. Clouds drifted like lazy ghosts. Children played in streets that once flickered out of existence. Governments argued over currency, not causality. It was over. The loop had been sealed. Joe was gone. But the cost was more than his absence. BRAVO1969 had never existed. Their names weren't erased. They had never been entered. There were no medals, no records, no thank you for saving the continuum. They were shadows of a team that officially never lived. Stacy found herself wandering to the edge of an abandoned comm tower. She stood there for nearly an hour, scanning the skies, not for threats, but for signs, for echoes, for anything that would tell her this wasn't another recursive trick. It wasn't. Time held steady, truly steady. Later that week, in what had once been Dome 9's underground ruins, now an unmarked bunker far beneath a decommissioned GEA station, Stephanie opened a black duffel bag that hadn't existed until the moment they returned. Inside, her old notebook. Pages torn, ink smudged, but every line intact. And a folded piece of paper, brittle at the edges. 3 names burned into the lower corner in perfect shimmering text. J. Burrow, S. Karma, S. Kim, no title, no rank. Just a list of ghosts who saved the world by choosing to be forgotten. They could have disappeared then. They almost did. But time doesn't respect retirement. Because 3 months later, Stacy intercepted a signal, low band, fragmented, full of paradox residue, a test loop, small, crude, amateur. But someone had built it, and someone else had activated it. Stephanie closed the notebook. "We start over," she said, smaller this time, quieter. They didn't ask permission. They didn't file paperwork. No Tac-Time, Stacy muttered. No oversight, no illusions. Stephanie pulled the paper with their names and taped it to the wall. Then she wrote one more line beneath it. Echo Unit 1. Not a team. Not a strike force. Not heroes. Watchers. Their job wasn't to protect the timeline anymore. It was to guard the fracture point, to stay ahead of the next recursion, to find the next Joe before he forgot who he was and rewrote the stars. Because if 21 years of hell had taught them anything, the loop never ends. But this time, someone would be watching when it began. Epilogue, 3 minutes gone. Date, 55:55. Location, GEA headquarters, Deep Archive, Sublevel 7. The lights flickered, once, no alarms, no alerts, just a silent pulse of something wrong. Deep beneath the Global Enforcement Authority's oldest facility, a terminal blinked to life for the first time in a century. A junior analyst, Kai Ren, ran routine integrity checks. Most logs were noise, failed missions, static data, until he found one. Timestamp, 0, Tac-Time mission start. 0037, return confirmed. New entry, subject deviation, 1. 3 returned, 1 stayed behind. When Kai tried to copy the file, the screen went black. Then a line appeared, he stayed behind. The loop is stable, for now, elsewhere. In a quiet study in the Alps, a woman closed a notebook. Its cover bore no title, just a scorched Tac-Time insignia. She placed it on the shelf. Stephanie Karma didn't look back. Down in the valley, Stacy Kim activated a beacon prototype. They hadn't spoken Joe's name in years, but both knew history forgets, time remembers. And somewhere outside time, a man in red walked alone. In his hand, a watch with no hands, blank, silent, waiting. He smiled, just a little, and kept walking. Tac-Time, BRAVO1969, 3 minutes gone, 21 years erased, and the future just woke up. Author's note. What you just listened to was never meant to be a time travel story. It was a story about choice, about consequence, about what happens when the line between memory and mission gets blurred, and the only way forward is through yourself. BRAVO1969 was the beginning of the end, but it was never the end of the beginning. Please subscribe to catch Tac-Time, Echo 1. The loop is closed, but something's still watching. And time still has secrets left to keep. Thank you for watching. Please like and share this story. Brian M. Brumbaugh.